they had a lot of interesting discussions with Russian partners about the protection of nuclear materials and other issues. Very important, but the main thing is that they demonstrated how important is Russian-American cooperation, and that we have a lot of interest in many areas, mainly in security areas, where we have to cooperate, independently with some differences which we may have on other international issues. And we are very glad to have them today here, and I give the floor to Senator Nunn. We have 1 hour of meeting, and after their words, we will have the chance, or you will have the chance to ask Senator to make questions or your comments about any questions you want without any limitation.
That's right. Now, there may be limitation on the answers. Well, I'm delighted to have a chance to be here and very pleased to be with my good friend Igor, who is, I told him a few minutes ago, he is in demand all over the world. He has tremendous credibility everywhere, and he's got to pace himself because everybody wants Igor to come to every event in every country that is important. So we are very pleased and delighted that Igor is a part of the organization we call the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and we are very pleased that he has helped facilitate our visit here, and we are very appreciative that the Russian International Affairs Council is hosting this important meeting. So let me talk about 10 minutes. I know my colleagues are going to be making their statement. We've just had a 2-day conference where we've had scientists from the U.S. and from Russia, people who've worked in the laboratories, people who've been in the Ministry of Defense, people who've been in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, talking about how we get the relationships back together in terms of communication, all important communication, even when we disagree. So I'm here in Moscow, but I'm here under very difficult circumstances in terms of relationships between the United States and Russia, indeed Russia and Europe. Bilateral cooperation has been largely frozen, and the channels of communication are few and far between, with the important exception of the recent agreement in principle on Syria, which is enormously important, that has just been agreed to, led by the Minister of Foreign Affairs here and the Secretary of State in the United States. And that agreement, of course, awaits execution, which is the hardest part of all and will require tremendous amount of cooperation between the United States and Russia at every level, Department of Defense, Intelligence, and State Department, as well as others. Igor captured the mood pretty well in the Moscow Times last week when he said, and I quote Igor Ivanov, "Our will to work together has not only weakened, it has sunk to a historic low," end quote. So I'm glad to see so many young people here who are going to straighten out what the older generation has inflicted on our two countries in the last 2 or 3 years. We have to change course, and we have to change course together. If not, we risk leaving behind a dangerous world for your generation, the young people around this table, and for my children and my grandchildren. At the height of tensions of the Cold War, back when we had huge ideological differences, we managed to work together to maintain strategic stability by fostering an open, direct military and policy dialogue. And so my question is, if we could do it then, when we had fundamental ideological differences, why can't we do it now? I see my friend Sergei Rogov sitting here. He knows what I'm talking about when I talk about the strategic stability kind of conversations we used to have all the time, because Sergei is one of the foremost experts on that whole subject. So as I view it, our challenges are both clear and dangerous. There's a corrosive lack of trust and understanding between U.S. and Russia leaders. We've had an aggressive rhetoric regarding nuclear weapons being used. There's no agreed process or an agenda for the next steps on nuclear arms control and risk reduction and what I call strategic stability. Both the United States and Russia have announced major and very expensive nuclear modernization programs that for the young people sitting around the table, you're going to be paying for the next 30, 40 years. New missiles, new subs, new bombers in both the United States and Russia. Nuclear security cooperation has largely come to a standstill at a time when threats from terrorist organizations are more pronounced and on the rise. The Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty has eroded, but strategic stability and crisis prevention continue to require clear understanding of intentions and force postures. Wars happen most of the time when there's no understanding of the other side's intentions. That is extremely dangerous. I've spent a lot of my time in the last 20, 30 years trying to get leaders in both our countries, so far unsuccessfully I might add, to think in terms of increasing warning and decision time, meaning that it is not in the interest of the United States for the Russian leader not to have ample time to make a decision if his military leader comes in and says, we think there may be some missiles heading our way. We do not want decision to use nuclear weapons to be something that is rushed. We don't want it to happen at all, God forbid, but we want leaders in both of our countries to have plenty of time before they make that kind of decision. But today they do not have plenty of time. It's a matter of minutes. That is fundamentally against the interest of our country and against the interest of your country. I've said often in America and other places that we, U.S., we have an existential stake in your warning systems working correctly. If they don't, guess what happens? The fact that we could have enough weapons survive to retaliate if you hit us with a first strike is very little comfort. I saw a supercomputer model not long ago in Scientific America magazine, and even if you discount it somewhat, it's still pretty sobering. It basically took a computer run at a hypothetical war between India and Pakistan with 100 nuclear weapons being used. The result was a couple of 100 million people killed immediately, and because of the huge blocking of the sun that would occur because of that many weapons, 100, and we have thousands. The blocking of the sun and the effect on agricultural regions all over the world, particularly the third world countries, would probably kill over the next 10 years from starvation 1 billion, 1.5 billion people. That's 100 weapons, and we have thousands. So as Sig Hecker said to our conference several times in the last 2 days, leaders have to understand that nuclear weapons are different. There's not, the consequences are huge. The consequences are huge. There's no doubt that strong disagreements over Ukraine and Syria have severely damaged the U.S.-Russian relationship as well as trust across the Euro-Atlantic region. These disagreements have led to military forces deployed in close proximity and an increased danger of accident or miscalculation. And the unfortunate shoot down of a Russian jet by Turkey is just an example of things going wrong that could be an even higher risk situation if that kind of conflict or shoot down occurred between U.S. and Russia. So a significant concentration of both conventional and nuclear forces combined with not the kind of communication we have even had in the Cold War is a dangerous situation for all of us. Our friend Alexei Arbatov, who attended our conference in the last 2 days, I don't think Alexei's here today, but he recently wrote, and I think these words are worth all of us thinking about. He said, quoting him, "The great paradox of our times is that since the late 1980s, the number of nuclear arms has been reduced almost by an order of magnitude, but the threat of their use is presently higher than a quarter of a century ago." End quote. Alexei, in a recent article, also raised a number of important questions that are worth reflecting on by our leaders. First question he posed, can our leaders still agree, as Reagan and Gorbachev did, that there can be no winners in a nuclear war? Second question, can our leaders still agree that strategic stability is of utmost importance to our bilateral relations? Third question, can our leaders agree to cooperate on common interests like nuclear security and the fight against radical extremism? Can our leaders set aside Cold War zero-sum thinking to advance our mutual security and reduce major risk? That's the end of his questions. Let me add one other question that I think is very important. Can our leaders, as well as our citizens, recognize that we are in a new era where nation states no longer have a monopoly over weapons of mass destruction and disruption when you look at the cyber world? The bottom line is that we're in a race between cooperation and catastrophe. And cooperation in the last couple of years seems to be at best taking a very slow walk. So how do we get the ox out of the ditch? Let me offer just a few thoughts in closing. First suggestion, prominent leaders must recognize that reckless rhetoric creates an atmosphere that could lead to dangerous misunderstandings and miscalculations, particularly when that rhetoric is about nuclear weapon use, including misunderstandings and miscalculations throughout the military chain of command. Henry Kissinger was here in Russia about 2 weeks ago, and he said in his remarks called the Primakov Lecture in honor of former Prime Minister Primakov, quoting Henry Kissinger, the fate of U.S. and Russia remain tightly intertwined, end quote. I agree with that. Second recommendation, the United States and Russia must revive and strengthen channels of communication. We can no longer afford to treat dialogue as a bargaining chip. You upset us and we will punish you by not talking is not a sound strategy for two countries that control 90% of the world's nuclear weapons and over 90% of the world's nuclear materials that could be weapons usable materials. So continuous dialogue is essential between our military leaders and our intelligence communities. That is not happening today. The NATO-Russian Council should be utilized effectively, which it was envisioned to be an instrument for communication to prevent crisis and to deal with crisis. And I think NATO and my own country are more at fault here, and that is we seem to think if we don't meet when there's a crisis, that will send the right signals. I think that is precisely wrong. I think we either ought to utilize it effectively or don't pretend that it's going to be used. And as a former member of the U.S. Senate, I strongly recommend beginning a dialogue between our parliamentary leaders, which we did even during the peak of the Cold War. Common sense would seem to tell us that it is counterproductive for both the United States and Russia to have sanctions on individuals who are in the parliament and policymakers that need to talk to each other to protect the security of the citizens they represent. Third suggestion, the United States and Russia should expand mechanisms that reduce the chances of military misunderstandings between our two countries. Last year's events in Turkey relating to the unfortunate shoot-down of the Russian jet serve as a powerful wake-up call that we need to reduce the chances of accidental encounters between NATO aircraft and between NATO and Russian aircraft as well as ships at sea. Fourth point, the United States and Russia should agree on confidence-building measures to reinforce strategic stability and further reduce the chances of miscalculation, including bolstering military-to-military communication. We should also utilize more robustly the nuclear risk reduction centers that we set up decades ago. These are centers that now receive notice of arms control, compliance, and so forth. They could be greatly expanded. Senator John Warner and I, a Republican and a Democrat, sponsored that, brought a proposal paper to Gorbachev that Reagan had approved the first half, and we were able to tell President Gorbachev this was something that President Reagan approved. The second half was our own proposal, which Reagan did not authorize us. We made that clear. But the second half was way back in the late 80s, was all about cooperating and communicating to prevent third country attack or terrorism. So that second half has never been implemented, and it's about 30 years overdue, in my view. Fifth point, the United States and Russia must work together in the fight against ISIS and violent extremism. The threat posed by ISIS directly affects the core national interest of both our countries. In particular, Russia and the United States must work together to ensure that ISIS or other violent extremist groups never acquire nuclear or radiological, i.e. dirty bomb, weapons, as well as other weapons of mass destruction. Our two countries have technical expertise and unique knowledge to lead that effort, and our scientists and our engineers and our military professions have worked together for much of the last 20 years. We have proven we can do it. This would not be something we have not already been able to do. We've done it, but we're doing it no longer. So I think that is a mission that we ought to undertake together. And it would fit well under the legal framework of UN Security Council 1540, as well as what is known as the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism. Russia is co-chair of that, and Russia played a leading role in setting it up. Most importantly, we must lead on a bilateral basis by developing a prioritized list of actions that can be taken together to prevent catastrophic nuclear terrorism. This is urgent and must be a front burner issue. I hope somehow we can get our two countries to take a lead on this subject. Finally, when we do work together, as we recently did on the Iran deal, and it never would have happened if U.S. and Russia had not been working together, we must learn to express our appreciation publicly so that political leaders, the media, as well as ordinary citizens of both countries recognize not just disagreements and confrontations, which is the case today too often, but also points of mutual interest in areas of success when we have success. As Igor recently said, and quoting him again, we must identify areas where our interests converge, such as combating international terrorism, preventing political extremism, managing migration flows, and solving the refugee problem, strengthening cyber and food security, tackling environmental issues, and coordinating on climate change. Those are important mutual interests to both of our countries. We have to find a way to work together on those. Quoting Igor, once trust is lost, it must be rebuilt step by solving problems and reducing risk together. Two front burner issues that are essential to begin rebuilding trust. First, both of our countries and our partners in the region need to work together to fully implement the terms of the Minsk Agreement concerning the dangers in Ukraine. And second, all sides must make a good faith effort, as I've already mentioned, to ensuring the effective implementation of the cessation of hostilities in Syria agreement announced the day before yesterday by Secretary Kerry and Minister Lavrov. As I've said before, it's very difficult to see how any agreement is going to solve the Syrian problem because it's such a difficult, chaotic problem. But we know for sure that if our military in Russia and the United States and our intelligence in Russia and the United States don't work together, that this agreement cannot work. That is absolutely essential. Let me conclude on a positive note by saying that when the United States and Russia do manage to cooperate on regional or global issues, great things can happen for the mutual benefit of both of our countries and indeed the world. As Igor recently said, and quoting him again, to avoid catastrophe, we must choose cooperation, not confrontation. And as former Secretary of Defense in the United States, Bob Gates, said, and I'll close with these comments, quoting Gates, "One Cold War is enough." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. My name is Ivan Timofeyev. I'm a director of programs here at RUAC, and it's a privilege for me to be a moderator of this meeting today. I must say that we have a good tradition in RIAG of conversation between prominent American speakers and our emerging leaders, experts, young scholars. And last year, when we had a meeting on the margins of Munich Security Conference, I kept in mind an opportunity that you could come to Moscow and we could organize such a meeting. And I'm very happy that this idea came true. And beside these young faces, we have also a broadcasting of our meeting in the internet at our web portal, which is a communication platform for our scholars in international relations. So, in fact, we have much more people attending our meeting today. I think hundreds, probably thousands. I hope so. I hope that we have such an amount of IR scholars here. But before we start our discussion, I would like to give a floor to our two American guests and to Dr. Michael Lowenthal and Dr. Siegfried Hecker. Dr. Lowenthal, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation from Minister Ivanov, and I'll just say I was asked to speak about nuclear science cooperation. I am a less familiar figure to other people, so I'll just say that I work at the National Academy of Sciences in the United States. I direct the Committee on International Security and Arms Control there, which has had a 35-year, so far, dialogue with a counterpart group by the same name in first the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union and now the Russian Academy of Sciences. And my own background is in physics and nuclear engineering, and for many years in nuclear meetings I was the youngest person in the room. And every year the average age of the group would advance by 1 year. So I'm delighted to see that there are people younger than I am here by a good bit, and that's particularly important because we need the next generation to carry this forward. I'll talk a little bit about the common interests in the nuclear field related to science. You know, there's a lot of cooperation that could go on, but particularly related to science. There's science for the expansion of our knowledge of the universe, and there's a great deal of work that we can do together on neutrino science and other areas. There's work that can be done on nuclear medicine, and so diagnostics and treatments. There's work that can be done on nuclear energy, on nuclear safety, on nuclear environmental remediation, and of course nuclear security. In nuclear energy, we often think about the design of reactors, which is a promising area for us to cooperate in, but it really gets down into the meat of the core of the reactor. We can work together on designing new advanced fuels. We can use our unique facilities in Russia and in the United States to advance our understanding of materials. We can even do biophysics experiments, actually, with some of these facilities. On nuclear safety, we are not yet safe enough with nuclear power. We always can make it safer. It has a good track record, but certainly not perfect. There are still things to be learned from the accidents that we have had, and we only advance well when we cooperate in this. It has been said many times that an accident anywhere is an accident everywhere. So we have a common interest in promoting safety in every country. And as the countries that built the first reactors and have advanced the nuclear field the farthest, we need to cooperate on that. On environmental cleanup, both countries have enormous legacy problems, shall we say, from the Cold War. We have radioactive waste, we have contaminated areas that are unique in themselves, but the challenges that we face in our two countries have a lot of commonalities, and we will only benefit if we cooperate on those challenges. And then in nuclear security, we really have a common interest in preventing nuclear terrorism, as the senator said. And this means shutting down smuggling routes, detecting nuclear material where we can, and sharing best practices everywhere. One of the issues that's raised on this list here is what has been achieved in 20 years of cooperation. And my friend and colleague to my left will have a great deal more to say about this perhaps than I do, but I would say there are very concrete accomplishments: securing materials, promoting the best practices that we have, putting much greater awareness out there. But there are also intangibles that are perhaps even more important, and those are the relationships that have been built up between the practitioners in the two countries and the channels of communication that are established. The cooperation that has happened historically has led to having people in positions of responsibility who know something about how things are done in the other country and know the people in the other country. And that is valuable in a way that it's hard to capture. So I'll close by saying that science is inherently an international and collaborative activity. Centuries ago, we know that scientists in Russia and in the United States knew each other. They knew of each other's work. We know that Lomonosov knew of Benjamin Franklin's work, and Franklin only missed out on corresponding with him because he was so advanced in age and unfortunately died before they could correspond. My own advisor back at Berkeley, when I was studying for my PhD, is a plasma physicist who remembered very fondly the time that he got to meet Sakharov. And it was important to him. Science is just inherently international. And that's the isolation that came with the Cold War was an unnatural state for science in its modern form. And so even in very dark days of the Cold War, in 1959, the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union and the National Academy of Sciences in the United States reached an agreement to promote exchanges between our countries on science. So this continued through very dark times and in good times. And the reason that it carried forward is because we have a common interest, a shared twofold mission in science. First, that pure piece of trying to advance knowledge of our universe, and then the applied piece where we use that knowledge to try and improve the lot of people in society. And I'll just really close by saying that our nations and the world are more prosperous, they're stronger, and they're safer when we cooperate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lowenthal. And now I give a floor to Dr. Siegfried Hecker, who served for more than 10 years as the director of Los Alamos National Laboratory and who is now a director emeritus of the laboratory.
Thank you very much, Mr. Iganov. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I've had the pleasure of being in Senator Nunn's company, but I'm particularly pleased to be here in the company of all the young people, because it makes me feel at home, because in addition to being director emeritus, that means something former that you have been, I am professor at Stanford University. And I teach a class on technology and international relations. And every fall I have 250 Stanford students in that class. And we talk about all things nuclear, and we talk about the issues in the world. So just one comment I want to make to reinforce what my colleague Michael Lowenthal just said in terms of scientific discoveries and working together. For those of you who are scientists, you know the most exciting announcement in the last couple of months was an international collaboration found the gravitational waves of Einstein 100 years later. And there's a professor at Nizhny Novgorod who contributed to that discovery. And of course there are lots of Americans, Italians, and from all over the world. It couldn't have been done otherwise. But what I want to talk about is indeed to answer that question, what's been done in 20 years related since we've had nuclear cooperation. So, Senator Nunn pointed out, during the Cold War, we had major concerns because there were so many weapons under different circumstances in the hands of governments, and we were afraid that governments would use those weapons. But then our world changed dramatically just about 25 years ago when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union broke up. And it's important now, as you look back at that time, how dramatically the nuclear threat changed, because all of a sudden, instead of being worried about nuclear assets, weapons, materials, etc., being in the hands of governments, now we were worried that they would be out of the hands of governments. In other words, the government loses control of those nuclear assets. And it turns out that time was a great time of personal change for me, because I came to Los Alamos actually 50 years ago as a student, younger than you are. And then for the first 25 years, I worked at Los Alamos to help develop the technologies for the nuclear deterrent to deter the Soviet Union. And then we had this dramatic change, and now for the last 25 years, I've worked with Russia to prevent the common threat that we faced. So, what was that threat? How did it change? And the way it really came home for me, that 24 years specifically today, 24 years ago today, I was in Sarov, the home of Viniev. We call it the Russian Los Alamos. I was there. And the next day I went to Snezhinsk, what we call the home of the Russian Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. So can you believe that? My world changed from where we were targeting weapons against each other to the next day I was greeted by Yuli Borisovich Khariton, who said, I've been waiting 40 years for this moment, as I landed in Sarov. And we were there. We looked at their facilities. They toured us through. We discussed the issues that concerned us. And what was so amazing, when I finished this tour of Sarov, I looked at my colleagues, and they spoke a different language, but it was like looking in the mirror. These people were just like us. They were doing their job to protect their country, just like we were doing our job to protect our country. So these were times of troubles for Russia. And from a U.S. standpoint, it was also thought these were times of trouble. And so the U.S. looked at it as sort of four big troubles. Loose nuclear materials, loose nukes, loose nuclear weapons, potentially getting away. Nuclear materials, nuclear people, experts, and potential for nuclear exports, that is, selling things. So that was of great concern to the United States, and rightly so, because certainly as people like Sergei Rogov knows, 30,000 or so nuclear weapons in the Soviet Union at that time. Over 1 million kilograms of fissile materials, and it takes 10 or a few tens of kilograms to make a bomb. 1 million kilograms. And 1 million people in your Minatom complex. And then, just this huge complex and the potential for export. And it turns out our Russian colleagues were also concerned because they had unprecedented numbers of nuclear weapons coming back to be transported, to be dismantled, the fissile materials to be stored. And they had to do this in a time of economic chaos and political change. So that was the threat, and it was incredible, and it was such that it brought the two countries together. So 25 years ago, this October, Viktor Mikhailov, who eventually headed up the Ministry of Atomic Energy, came to the United States to discuss those issues. And then just a few months later, I was here in Russia. So the concerns were there, and what's important for people like you to know that, particularly in contrast to where we are today, these were historic times of cooperation. These two countries came together in an incredible way. On the United States, our presidents actually took actions. President George H.W. Bush, that is Bush the first, President Clinton followed up. And then we had the fortune of having visionaries like Senator Sam Nunn with his colleague Richard Lugar to craft the Nunn-Lugar legislation, to provide the funds, to provide the vision, to provide the overall umbrella where one could actually work on these things cooperatively, because they said, look, this world has changed. It's no longer this confrontation. You have to cooperate to do this. And then the scientific world stepped in, and fortunately we, scientists from Los Alamos, my colleagues, we went to Sarov and to Snezhinsk, and they came to Los Alamos, they came to Livermore, they came to our sites. So what did we do in that time? Well, we tackled the real problems. So disassembly of nuclear weapons, that's the most dangerous phase of the lifetime of a nuclear weapon. It's been out there aging, changing, rusting, and now you have to bring it back and take it apart and not have it blow up. You have to transport it at times when we worried about the security of those. We worked together to help and assist the Russians to protect the weapons. Of course, we didn't get our hands on the weapons, but we shared areas, we shared capabilities to do that. We then also worked on nuclear materials security. That was particularly my great interest. And so we worked with them. We came to each other's facilities. We worked in each other's facilities. They came to Los Alamos. We came to Vinitiev. And so, in addition to when we came, we also realized that, the U.S. government didn't quite have it correct, because they viewed all of Russian nuclear complex as being nothing but a danger. And sort of the perfect nuclear storm was brewing. We're going to get all these loose problems. And what we recognized by going into the Russian facilities, talking to their people, they viewed the nuclear as an asset. Not an inheritance from hell, but more like a gift that they worked for from heaven. And so they viewed this as important. They viewed the weapons as providing their sovereignty. The materials, that's the future. And it's worth a lot of money. The people, they were going to help to reconstitute the economy. And the export, they wanted to legitimize to have a high-tech export. So then we learned to work together to say, look, we not only are here to prevent bad things, we're here to do good things. And so we did science together. I told you gravitational wave. Together, Los Alamos, Vinitiev, we created the world's largest magnetic fields with a device that Sakharov initially designed and then his colleagues carried on. And then we provided diagnostics, and together we had 400 publications on the subject of what we call pulse power. Joint publications of American and Russian nuclear weapons scientists were working together in this. But in the meantime, we also took care of these security problems. As we look back now, 25 years later, that perfect nuclear storm. So what happened? Well, there were no loose nukes. No nuclear weapons got away. Nuclear materials, very little when you think of the 1 million kilograms. Nuclear experts, the experts, we were worried about brain drain. There wasn't much of anything. And exports, there were a few problems in the 90s, but Russia has become very responsible. So it didn't happen. So what did we accomplish, you ask? What we accomplished was this perfect nuclear storm that catastrophe didn't happen. And today, your complex is in better shape than it's been in the last 25 years. Nuclear weapons complex is in better shape. The people are in better shape. Your arsenal, unfortunately, is changing to some extent. We're, a little bit concerned about that. But in 25 years, this potential great danger didn't happen, and it happened because we cooperated. Okay, so now let me turn. So what does that mean, in the future? We did build up one other thing, and Micah mentioned this. We build up a reservoir of goodwill. We know each other. We trust each other. We respect each other. And even though right now, within the present, our cooperation is pitched off by our governments, we're essentially no longer working together. The reservoir of goodwill is still there, and if our governments can unlock that reservoir, it will come back. And does it need to come back? The answer is yes, because nuclear safety and security, you're never done. And just when you think you are done, that's when you're going to get trouble. You're going to get complacency, you're going to get surprised. So you're never, ever done. We have to continue to work together. It's different now than it was in the early 90s. We work together now as real partners, but we did this anyway as scientists. So the danger today then is that as we look at nuclear things, and it was already said, nuclear is different than everything else. As you know, you split the nucleus, you get 1,000,000 times the energy. You can do good with that, make electricity and lots of good things, or you can do bad with that. The only way you can control that is through cooperation. You must cooperate. So cooperate will bring you the benefits. Isolation will lead to catastrophe. And what we're doing right now is we're isolating. Your country is isolating your nuclear scientists from working with us. And our country is isolating your country. And so isolation leads to catastrophe. Cooperation is what's important. So what I'm here to try to convince you is, yes, we've done a lot of good in these 25 years. The catastrophe didn't happen. We need to continue to work together, and we're just waiting for the governments in order to understand that nuclear is different. You can't hold it hostage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hager. Of course. And before we start our conversation with the emerging experts and leaders, I would like to give a floor to the patriarch of our Russian-American studies, academic Sergei Rogov. Please, the floor is yours.
I am happy to participate in the meeting of the young experts with you, Sam, and other members of American team. It makes me feel younger. Actually, sometimes I have a feeling that like we are in 1983, when the negotiations between the Soviet Union and the United States ended, when we were really in a very, very risky situation, and the war scare could have led to a real nuclear confrontation. And it's a shame that 33 years after that, we again will have this kind of experience. So when you suggested what could be done, I also have some ideas which I would like to impose on you. One related to what happened 30 years ago. It was leadership by Reagan and Gorbachev which allowed to overcome the rhetorics, to resume talks, and eventually sign crucial agreements which helped not only to reduce the risk of a nuclear war, but to end the Cold War, and permitted us to try to build a totally different relationship based on partnership and not on rivalry. Unfortunately, it didn't happen that way. We have to admit, 25 years later, that we did fail, and it's the new generation which is supposed, hopefully, to finish what we started, because it's an uphill process. 3 ideas. One, you mentioned the role of the parliamentary discussions. It's a shame that 4 years ago the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives stopped formally meeting Russian State Duma members and the Council of Federation members. Remember, Sam, when we met at the height of the Cold War, still the parliamentary links existed. And I think that reflects a situation when in both countries today we are lacking strong positive pressures to move in the direction we want to. And let me mention something, maybe you know that, but the Espen Institute is organizing in the beginning of May, Ben Glickman, a meeting in Germany, half a dozen of members of the Senate and the House, half a dozen of members of Bundestag, and half a dozen of members of the Russian Parliament are supposed to meet there to discuss the agenda which will deal with many of the questions we have. And I hope that maybe you can help to let the people from the U.S. Congress really to understand the importance of this kind of a dialogue. The second idea is related to what was mentioned already when you were talking about risk reduction. Now, well, there is another term quite fashionable, deconfliction. It didn't exist 25 years ago, deconfliction. It was invented just 6 months ago. So why don't we call it a deconfliction center? Since there is very little enthusiasm nowadays in both countries for deep reductions or de-alerting. But deconfliction, this is something which could go beyond what we tried to do with JDAC 16 years ago. It can cover not only the launches of exchange of information about the launches of ballistic missiles, but other problems, not only related to nuclear weapons, but also to space developments and cyber developments. Since on both sides today there is enormous concern about what the other guy is doing and enormous suspicion of what is happening. And for instance, the discussion of the cyber offensive systems as the founding stone of the deterrence of a cyber attack makes me really worry very much, because, well, how you make deterrence credible? You demonstrate your offensive capability, and the other guy interprets that as an intention which has nothing to do with defense, but offensive, with offensive purposes. And this kind of deconfliction center or network can include not only Russia and the United States, but will help to engage, I hope, China, the United Kingdom, and France. Apparently, we cannot expect them to get involved in nuclear weapons reduction negotiations soon, in particular when Russia and the United States don't talk about it anymore. But deconfliction, this is something which could be maybe a backdoor to engaging, not only resuming serious discussions between our two countries, but engaging others. And finally, the strategic stability. We have to do some brainstorming about the issue of strategic stability, because today strategic stability is much broader term than it used to be 30 or 40 years ago. It's no more limited only with strategic nuclear weapons. It also includes some non-nuclear weapons, conventional offensive sophisticated weapons, precision guidance, long-range systems. It includes ballistic missile defense. It includes, as I mentioned, space and cyber. And the challenge is that we cannot do simultaneously with all those areas, but we cannot ignore them. And here I come back to Gorbachev and Reagan period. When in 1985 they agreed to resume negotiations dealing with the problems which existed today in three baskets. You remember it was strategic nuclear weapons, intermediate range nuclear weapons, and space ballistic missile defense. So while we may try to tackle the issue of the new broad strategic stability by launching discussions with 5 or 6 baskets. So it's not limited only to traditional agenda of strategic nuclear weapons. That is particularly important for the Russian side because there is an enormous concern in Russia, as you know, about American non-nuclear capabilities. And frankly, that may be one of the reasons why Russia officially is not enthusiastic about the resumption of negotiations which President Obama suggested several years ago. Of course, it's going to be very difficult to turn the tide, but I applaud what you're trying to do, and maybe we can succeed, at least permitting the new generation to finish the work which we started.
Thank you very much, Sergei Mikhailovich. So now I would like to open a discussion, and I saw the first hand on that corner, Dr. Istomin from GIMO, and the second hand, Natalia Bubnova from Carnegie. Yeah. No, from MIMO.
Thank you so much, Igor Istomin, GIMO. Thank you. First of all, thank you for RIAC for organizing this great event, and thank you so much for the speakers for the great presentations. I have a question building upon the initial comment by Senator Nunn when he said that wars happen when states misunderstand each other's intentions. And just today, Financial Times came up with another piece on the report that claimed that NATO has no opportunity to protect Eastern Europe, to protect Baltics in case of the Russian invasion in the Baltics. And I think that that just stating this as a contingency is to some extent an misunderstanding of the Russian intentions. So the question is how to signalize Russian intentions. In February, earlier this month, there was a conference in Munich where Prime Minister Medvedev participated, and it was seen in Russia as a message of deconfliction, of signalizing that Russia is seeking cooperation with the West. But many in the West interpreted his words as a threat of the new Cold War. So the question is how Moscow could signalize to the West absence of aggressive intentions without at the same time giving up on its interests and without being perceived as weak and be taken for granted. Thank you.
I think you have asked the difficult question for the leaders of our two countries now. How do we get out of this situation we're in that seems to be spiraling in the wrong direction? The Syrian cessation of conflict agreement that was reached recently between Kerry and your foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov, is enormously important. It's going to be difficult, as I mentioned, to make it work, but we have to be caught trying, and our defense leaders must work together. Our military leaders must work together. Intelligence leaders must work together, because obviously we've got to define, if we're both going to bomb ISIS, we've got to define who the terrorists are. And without intensive intelligence cooperation, we're not going to have a common definition. And the common definition is essential, it seems to me. I'm no expert on the agreement. So the first thing is we got to have our top leaders bless and mandate, in fact, military to military and intelligence to intelligence communication. That's on Syria. We have, of course, a huge amount of distrust has grown out of Ukraine, Crimea, and so forth. I had a friend of mine, a good friend, well known, I won't quote him, but I'll quote a Chinese person he quoted. So this is a roundabout quote. The lawyers would say this is not admissible evidence. But in any event, basically he had a view from at least this particular individual Chinese. He said recently in terms of events that Ukraine has lost Crimea, Russia has lost Ukraine, the West has lost Russia, and the globe has lost stability. Now, that may not all fit into exactly a pattern, but there's something to it. The trust that is absolutely essential has been lost between the United States and Russia. Not completely. We'll still have a lot of people who can work together, as Sig has said. There are a lot of people, relationships and so forth. But most importantly, Russia's neighbors are frightened. Russia's neighbors either want to join NATO, or if they're already in NATO, they want a very large buildup because they're frightened. The Russian intent is not known in terms of the Baltics, in terms of Eastern Europe. That's why countries want ballistic missile defense on their soil. That's the circle we're in. And the missile defense deployments, as Igor and I were talking, are viewed as a threat by the Russian military. So I know no way out of this except to begin to really communicate, and that means at every level. And we're going to have to communicate even when we don't agree, and even when we argue. We've got to continue, or we strike the word continue, we've got to greatly accelerate and strengthen the communication at every level to avoid misunderstandings. And then you add to the distrust, you add to that the proximity of our military forces, airplanes flying, and that's why they're talking deconflicting. But I'll tell you, I've been around long enough to know you can deconflict all you want to, and we must try. But you still can have accidents. You still can have things go wrong. You've got jet planes flying near each other. You've got military jets flying near passenger planes. You've got ships at sea. You've got movement of forces that are not regulated or not subject to notification. You've got basic propaganda that is not believed. The West doesn't believe what some of the statements coming out of Russia. And I'm sure Russia doesn't believe some of the statements coming out of the U.S. So when you start spiraling downward, it's a real danger. We've got to break out of it. Because if we don't find a way to move upward, not all at once, but step by step and build trust, then it becomes increasingly dangerous. So Syria, we have to work together to try to make that cessation of hostilities work. On Ukraine, we've got to enforce and comply with the Minsk agreement. That's the agreement everybody made. And if we don't comply with it, the trust is going to go further down. And that's both sides. Not just the United States and Russia, but our friends and allies.
Thank you.
Natalia. But let me add one other point. Beyond all that, even while these disagreements are going on, we have got to cooperate on the nuclear side. We've got to have discussions about what we each intend to do on nuclear modernization. I don't think anyone wants another Cold War. And, the United States defense budget over the next 10 years on just nuclear weapons and delivery systems is like $350 billion. And everything I know about the Russian plans, and both sides are planning now, is probably that much or more. And so here we go again. This is where I came into the movie, as the old saying goes. I don't want to see this movie again. I don't want my children and grandchildren to have to live through it. I don't want your generation to have to live through it. It's extremely dangerous. During the Cold War, we had enough close calls. There's a new movie out called The Man Who Saved the World about a Russian. Now, I have no idea how accurate it is, but nevertheless, it's a powerful movie. There's a new book out, Command and Control, about a near disaster in American missile field. We've had a number of close encounters. We've had false warnings, and you add to that the cyber world, which can give false warnings even between countries like India and Pakistan, and it's very apparent that we are not likely to be as lucky in the next 50 years as we have been in the last 50 years. In my view, we had professionals on both sides, military professionals. They were very good. We had good leadership on both sides that understood the danger of escalation. We avoided war. We kept our allies out of war that would have escalated in Europe, particularly, right up the ladder. We avoided using battlefield tactical nuclear weapons, which could have escalated right up. So we did a lot of things right, but we were also very, very lucky. Very, very lucky. And I do not think the odds favor that kind of good fortune holding out if we go back into this kind of atmosphere and environment.
Наталья Бубнова, Institute of World Economy and International Relations. I now work there, but I was fortunate to meet with Senator Nunn and with Dr. Siegfried Hacker while I was for 8 years at Carnegie. And I would want to thank you for your mission for coming to Moscow. I think it's very important. And there are many people who share your sentiment here and who do not want, of our generation in particular, to go back to where we were.
Thank you. You're a lot closer to this country.
I want to dissolve the illusion and to say that 40 years ago, almost to the date, when I was preparing to go for an internship to the Institute for U.S. and Canada Studies, I asked my good friend, who was already in a senior position at the Institute, what the most important topic was that I could deal with, that I could, the theme that I could join. And he said arms control, nuclear arms control. And I think it's no less important nowadays, maybe even more so, with the difficulties, with the crises, with the tensions that have grown in the last several years internationally. The arms control, and the nuclear arms control in particular, has become more important because of the dangers. It should not be perceived, as George Bush once said, as the legacy, he said, relic of the Cold War, and it should not become a victim of a new Cold War either. Yet throughout all these 40 years now, I think we're in a situation when arms control is in the worst possible position of all times. Arguably, it's even perhaps in a worse shape than our bilateral relations, all but dead. So, and we should not be saying that we did this thing, we have done it, and you are now to mend it up. We should all join in efforts to try to use the brain, the youth, and the energy to repair the situation. I suggest, I fully agree with the proposals that have been done, made here, as to what should be done in this field. And I would like to add my 5 points, 5 E's as I call them. First, enforce the existing treaties. State our adherence to those treaties, declare that we still are to abide by them. Second, enact the dormant treaties. President Obama, when entering White House, promised to ratify the CTBT and to sign the Fissile Material Treaty. And they're still, are they still on his table, despite the resistance of the Congress? They should go through, and that would help move to the third E that I have, engage other countries into the arms control process. By example, by making it clear that the 2 countries that possess 90% of the nuclear weapons of the world are leading the way, as they're supposed to, according to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The fourth E, encompass new weapon systems, enlarge the arms control process to cover new environments, space, deep seas, geographical areas such as the Arctic, the Middle East. There was supposed to be a conference on the non-nuclear status of the Middle East, which would still be a good idea, I think. And maybe add a sixth E, embrace new ideas and concepts for arms control. And regarding to this, I would like to ask a question. Do you believe, it's kind of like a hen and egg dilemma, do you believe that crisis pushes the way towards arms control, or to the contrary, it is the improved relations that provide the platform, the grounds for non-proliferation, arms control, treaties, negotiations? I think that it should be done from both sides, but some say that it's a crisis, as you heard several days ago, that would push the process forward. God forbid us, save us from crisis. And another question. Alexei Arbatov suggested, and Sergei Rogov today as well, that like in early 80s, we should consider, once we come to negotiations, each issue, each category of weapons separately. Strategic weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, strategic non-nuclear weapons, BMD systems, dissociate one from another and then try to resolve each issue separately. While just several years ago, there were suggestions made that possibly the United States would be willing to consider exchanging some prompt global strike systems for concessions on the Russian side with regard to tactical nuclear weapons. So is it still workable, or is it in the past? What is better? Which way to take? And finally, what I would like to say, that Obama might call us a regional power, and some might say that we are in our own local Cold War, but local though it may be, we know that nuclear weapons have a global reach. And as Dr. Hacker said, an accident anywhere is an accident for everyone, and it's especially true with regard to nuclear weapons. So it is a global problem in which we should be, in resolving which we should be all together. Thank you.
Well, I would say that I would hope that crisis would lead to arms control, but I'm not confident of that. I think what you don't want to have happen is have to have a disaster to lead people to arms control. My experience is that when relations got better, let's say between Reagan and Gorbachev, it created an atmosphere that made arms control much more possible. And when the United States under first George Bush, H.W. Bush, moved a lot of tactical nuclear weapons out of Europe, moved a lot of tactical weapons out of other places, including naval ships, it was because the atmosphere had gotten better. And it was also because there was enough trust that there was not an arms control agreement, but Brent Scowcroft told me personally that there was enough discussion so that President Bush, conservative Republican, was willing to move unilaterally on some things because he knew that Russia was going to follow. So they didn't spend all that time having an arms control agreement. You know, I've always thought that if the world was logical, that we would both agree to put fail-safes on our own missiles so that if one was ever fired by accident, we would be able to knock it down. Today, it's pretty bad to think about, but if a couple of missiles go off by accident, or renegade commander, or something of that nature, and you know the military will tell you it can't happen. I never believe when people say something can't happen. I think it can happen. If it happens today on either Russia-U.S. an accidental launch, the President of the United States, if it happened from America, or the President of Russia, would have to call the other one and say, "I'm sorry, we just launched 3 missiles towards one of your cities, it was an accident, believe me. We can't do anything about it. Satellites, we can knock down. If we have a satellite launch or goes out of thing, my understanding, Sig, you're the scientist, but my understanding is if it went out of control, we'll be able to alter it in some way. I'm no expert on that. So there's so much we can do. And if a man from Mars came down and looked at the fact that we still have only very short warning time, they would say, have you taken leave of your senses? Both countries. If it were me, I would think Sergei is probably right. I think with all the complexities we have now, any comprehensive arms control would probably have to have minimum of 3, maybe as many as 4, 5 different boxes. If it were me and it was up to me, I would put all the boxes under an umbrella to the extent they would fit. Maybe not all of them would fit, but I think it would fit under conventional, tactical, and strategic. And also first strikes with conventional precision-guided weapons. The umbrella would be warning and decision time. It would be a very simple concept. To both presidents, they would say to their people and to each other, we want more warning and decision time. And to the military, they would say, if I was the president of the United States, I don't want the president of Russia to have only 4 minutes or 5 minutes to decide whether to launch their missiles if they got a warning. Why would I want that? Why would I want, if I were the president of Russia, for America not to have but 5-10 minutes to make up their mind? If we ever, God forbid, have a president who drinks too much in either country, I would want them to have a chance to have a cup of coffee before deciding to start a nuclear war. Wouldn't you? I mean, these things are common sense. So I don't think we ought to get so technical that we don't keep in mind the basic common sense that is so needed.
Sam, Martians would never come since they had very little warning time.
Dr. Hicker, please.
Yes, I don't want to take time from you being able to ask questions, but I just wanted to add 2 quick comments to Natalia's comment. One is the importance of arms control still today, as it was 40 years ago. And then second, though, you raised at the end this issue of nuclear weapons accident. Well, the story that I told you of what we've done the last 25 years, these problems are different than arms control problems. They're different, and they're actually more complicated because if you talk about loose nukes or loose materials or people, now you have those decisions and the problems in the hands of those people. The arms control is in the hands of the government. Now all of a sudden you've handed this threat off to thousands of people who work in these complexes, and one of them being able to do something to get material away or give the knowledge away. So these are 2 different sets of problems. They're both extremely important. And for the second one, I didn't tell you, in 13 minutes I tried to tell you half of my life story, but I have another chance. And for people like you, we're just about finished with a book. And instead of 13 minutes, this book is 1,200 pages. And it's about U.S. nuclear cooperation that I just told you about. It's going to be about the cooperation and what was accomplished both from the Russian side and from the U.S. side. And the reason it's so long, it has incredible archival information in this book. And it also talks about the human factor of how it took for us to respect, to trust each other, to go do those sensitive things. And then when we were all done, nobody lost any secrets. We just solved problems together. So the book will be out in a couple of months. We're just about to the printer. What's the name?
Still working on it.
So, since you asked, so here it is. It's called Doomed to Cooperate. So at the end of the Cold War, we were doomed to cooperate. How American and Russian scientists joined forces to avert some of the greatest dangers of the post-Cold War nuclear
There was lots of film balloons that were Russians and Americans operated.
Natalia, if I may, I'll take up the question another question that you posed and that academician Rogov mentioned about what I would call full scope strategic stability, which is to say not just strategic nuclear weapons, but also all of these other considerations. And it's clear that our governments are not ready to have those discussions, but this is the time for academic studies to support those. And so there are a number of studies that are beginning in the United States within academic settings to figure out some of these issues in their synergies. You know, there are issues where they are linked. We can't treat them as wholly separate entities because the capabilities are connected in many ways. And so we hope to become a channel for having these discussions with our Russian counterparts who have actually been raising this issue for some time.
Thank you. Let me just say one word. I know how discouraging it must be to sit there as a young person and hear all this stuff from a bunch of old folks handing over the problems to you that we haven't solved. So let me put some positive information out there so you don't go away bleak. And there are some positive things. There's some very positive things. Sig has already referred to the trust that was built up between laboratories. People who built the weapons, who know and have the knowledge, built a great deal of trust. That hasn't all disappeared, but it can be unlocked. That's huge. Our military professionals, if they're given political mandates by the presidents and by the ministers of defense, they can have very professional conversations. They are professionals. They have good conversations. I've always favored more military-to-military talks. I'd like to see our NATO commander sit down with the head of your military forces. We need more of that. I'd like to see the Russian NATO Military Council, when we have a crisis, or even before a crisis, meet. So we have a mechanism, but they don't meet. So there's some other things. START agreement. I believe that the arms control agreement is about to be 5 years old. That was negotiated between the United States and Russia. It made modest reductions, but it has enormously important verification provisions. And verification is essential to trust. Essential to trust, and it's essential to enforcement. So that is everything I've heard in the United States is Russia is fully complying with that START agreement. And I hope the United States is fully compliant. Everything I know is both fully compliant. That's good news. We've got Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Lavrov working together on these problems. They're communicating. They are the exception to the lack of communication now. And I think we both all ought to be thankful that we've got our foreign ministers that are communicating, and they're working together on Iran and Syria. Russia helped immensely on Iran, as I mentioned. Without Iran and the United States, without Russia and the United States working together, we would not have had an Iran agreement. It's not a perfect agreement, but we brought probably 15 years, and we're going to have to work together to make sure that agreement is carried out. We've gone, in the last 20 years, we've gone from 50 countries that had weapons-usable nuclear material, well, enough weapon material to build a bomb. We've gone to 25. I believe it's 24 now. Andrew Leon's 24, 50 to 24. Protecting nuclear materials has been an area we've really cooperated on. Another bit of good news, we had probably 40 scientists and engineers sitting around the table for the last 2 days. They came up with like 50, 60 projects. Andrew's been leading this. He could comment. 50 or 60 projects to work together on, including we're really discussing how to work together on dirty bombs to prevent radiological weapons. Another thing, it doesn't get mentioned very often, but it should, particularly with the Ukrainian crisis we've got now. After the Soviet Union broke up, 3 countries gave up all their nuclear weapons. That was miraculous accomplishment in the early 1990s. That wouldn't have happened without the United States and Russia working together. That was of huge importance. You can imagine now the Ukrainian situation if there were nuclear weapons in Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. So these are just a few of the things. Let me just mention one more. there was a program called Megatons to Megawatts. That program basically took highly enriched uranium coming out of Ukrainian and to some extent Russian warheads, and it converted that to low enriched uranium, U.S. and Russia working together. That low enriched uranium was made into nuclear fuel. There was a 15-year contract between the United States and Russia. Russia processed and sold the fuel, and it was bought by America. Don't hold me to the dollars, but it was somewhere in the 12 to $16 billion that was transferred over those years. Russia got money when it very much needed money. Ukraine got their share of the money out of it. And the United States got nuclear materials for energy. When you look at the U.S. energy composition, 20% of our entire electricity in our country is nuclear. 20%, one out of one-fifth. 50% of the nuclear fuel we burned from about 1995 to about 2013, 50% of it was from those stockpiles of fuel that came from highly enriched uranium to low enriched uranium that was coming from missiles that had been aimed at America during the Cold War. So if you look at it like this, 1 out of every 10 light bulbs in America was being supplied with nuclear fuel from supplies that had come out of warheads aimed at us during the Cold War. So that's in compliance with the biblical admonition to turn swords into plowshares. We have worked together. We can work together. There's so many win-win propositions, and we've spent 2 days listening to marvelous ideas about how we can work together. So I think there's a lot to build on. There's a lot of things that young people can look forward to in working together. But I will leave you with just this thought. We've got to have young people in the United States and Russia talking to each other. You've got to talk to each other. We've got to have classes that are on satellites together. We've got the means to communicate. You've got to be talking about these issues. We've got to have a lot more understanding and trust by your generation than we have in my generation. That's how we solve these problems, doing it together.
Thank you. I saw 3 hands, the hand of Maria Usachova, Pasha Konevsky, and Yulia Nikitina. 4 hands. Okay, good. So Maria, be the first, please. But folks, be brief in your questions, please.
Okay. Thank you, Ivan Nikolaevich. I'm Maria Usachova, political scientist, but unfortunately not yet an expert on nukes. I have 2 questions. One is rather of realistic nature, another one is more romantic. The realistic one I would address to Mr. Hacker. Would there be a need for a CTR2 if Russia becomes weaker, like the U.S., like the Soviet Union did in the late 80s? And the romantic question is to Mr. Lowenthal. What do you think? Will be your grandchildren be able to live in the nuclear zero world like it was before 1945? Thank you very much.
So CTR2, let me put it this way. Is there a need to still work together cooperatively to reduce the nuclear risk? Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. I wouldn't call it CTR2. I would just call it something else, because those conditions 25 years ago were very different, and particularly what was different, so many of the nuclear risks were in Russia, and Russia needed economic help. And so that cooperation tended to be very one-sided. And this problem is not a one-sided problem anymore. It's both countries have to work at this. And so today, economic situation, is essentially even. And the risks are more evenly divided because the Russian, as I mentioned, the Russian complex has really weathered that storm. So it's in much better shape, but neither one of it is done. So what we've been discussing over the last 2 days is now it has to be done, to mutual benefit and with respect. And so whatever program is designed already by the governments has to have that as the main feature. These are threats we face both in our own countries and as well as third countries. We should be working together truly in a partnership mode. So I'd call it something else, but the idea of needing to work together is very important today.
So I'll cheat a little bit, and I'll add something to what Sig had said before I answer the romantic question. And that is that we've been talking a lot about how the cooperation improved security for facilities in Russia. But in fact, it also improved security for facilities in the United States, because working jointly on these problems, the United States went back and looked at some of its facilities and said, we really have to fix this. And so there has been a lot accomplished in both countries. It has been a two-way street. On this question of will my grandchildren live in a nuclear-free world, or I would say live under less risk of the nuclear danger. And I have great hope for that. I am worried about our situation, but I have great hope for that. And the reason I have great hope is because I know that my children are much smarter than I am. And they are going to make a lot of progress. So I do have good hope for that future.
Okay, Паша Коневский, Moscow, Lomonosov University.
Thank you, Ivan. Pavel Konevsky, professor of political science at Moscow State University. I would like to thank our American guests for coming to Moscow and for saying speeches. I think it's wonderful that we have such dialogues in these not very easy times. And I would like to outline one thing that wasn't mentioned today. We're talking a lot about importance of dialogue between younger generations, and there is one initiative that is supported both by RIAC and NTI, which is the Younger Generation Leaders Network, and it keeps functioning, and there are quite a few members of this network here, of which I'm a member myself, and I think we should have more of this kind of initiatives running because they prove to be very constructive and very productive. So the issues that we discussed today are very complicated and very multi-layered. I think it's very difficult to talk about everything. There is one wonderful question, I think, that is on the very bottom of the list, and we've discussed it today already, what opportunities exist for future scientific and technical collaboration. And the most important word here is future, I think. Because we're talking about engagement of new generations to this scientific technological cooperation between not only Russia and the United States, but between different countries. And I would say that it's true that trust is lost on a political level, first of all. Strangely, it's much more difficult to preserve the strategic balance in a multipolar world than it was in bipolar. And strangely, the more multipolarity we get, the more instability we get. And I think that one of the logical answers to solve this instability is integration. And we have to talk about integration, about different communities and scientific communities, of course, because scientific communities play a very important role as a second track of diplomacy, and we can talk about scientific diplomacy. And also, I think it's important to say that we have what I would call a positive generation gap today, because new generations that are taking positions right now in Russia and the United States and Europe and other countries, they don't have Cold War mentality. Even if they repeat some of the old cliches, I don't really think they sincerely believe in them. Well, at least at the moment. Maybe it will change for worse. I hope it will not. But what I would like to ask to, I think all the speakers, because all and Senator Nunn and Dr. Sloventhal and Hecker mentioned it, about scientific cooperation. Obviously, there are different layers for this sort of cooperation. And for example, there are very talented nuclear physicists both in Russia and the United States who should cooperate more. But right now, as it was mentioned by Senator Nunn, there are a lot of people-to-people contacts, which is very important. But what should be done, in your opinion, to establish more institutional frames for this context to become more systemic? Do we have to talk about some new kinds of institutions, cooperative funds, some new initiatives? And I think that, I wonder if you agree with this, that we should talk about cooperation, not as I said, not only between Russia and the United States, but between different countries, because these communities should become really international. The more multipolar world we get, the more integrated community we gotta have to get this world more stabilized. So I think it's a complicated question, of course, but what exact steps would you should be done in your opinion to establish this new kinds of institutional frames, and what frames are this in your opinion? Thank you.
Well, we at NTI, as you mentioned, we are proud to be sponsoring a Young Leaders Network, and Russian young leaders and U.S. and European young leaders, including Ukraine and Russians, meeting together, talking together. Leon Ratz is one of our key NTI people, and he's been invaluable in setting up this trip, and he's part of that Young Leaders group. So, Leon, why don't you give them a little perspective on what we're trying to do and what the young leaders are doing?
Well, as you know, we'll be meeting in Brussels in just a couple of days next week. It's been an extraordinary group. It's had a number of meetings in Sarajevo and all over Europe and Sofia. And I'm a fairly new member of the group. I've joined NTI just about a year and a half ago. But I think it's an exceptionally important forum. This is a forum where we're talking about not just the future of Ukraine, but also the Euro-Atlantic region as a whole. And it's bringing together young people from Ukraine, from Russia, from the United States, from all over Europe to talk about these issues. And not just to talk, but to listen to one another, which is, I've got to say, there are few forums where one can have the privilege of actually listening to one another and having a conversation without any constraints. And that's really what we've tried to do with the Younger Generation Leadership Network. And that's been, as Senator Nunn said, a partnership with REAC and with other partners. And we need more of those kinds of institutions. I can say that most young people in the United States have never been to Russia. Most young people in the United States haven't talked to a Russian individual. And so when they see on TV certain characterizations of Russia, particularly negative characterizations of Russia, you could imagine that many of them just believe it. And so we've got to find ways to expand people-to-people contacts. We've got to find ways to expand opportunities for young people to talk to one another and to really build up that trust that Senator Nunn said is so lacking.
The one other thought I would have, first I'd like to say your whole comments were very, very encouraging to me. And it makes all the things we're trying to do worthwhile. So I'm very encouraged about your outlook and your viewpoint and the optimism you have about the future. We are trying to do one other thing, we being NTI, and that is I've worked with Igor Ivanov and Wolfgang Ischinger from Germany and Des Brown from Great Britain in trying to establish some type of leadership group. And if it can't be done by governments now, which is probably not going to be done by governments, by track 2 groups, so that we begin to have communication about crisis prevention, about crisis avoidance, about crisis management, all of which we need to work on now, but also about Euro-Atlantic security writ broad. What do we want Euro-Atlantic region to look like in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? What role does Russia want to play? Those are crucial questions that we need to understand where Russia's thinking is on this. What is Russia's vision about 5, 10 years, 20 years from now? Part of Europe, part of the Euro-Atlantic security. How do we think about that? How do we visualize that? That's the kind of discussion we're trying to get going now. And I don't think it's going to happen by governments in the next year or so. I'd like for it to, but so I'm really hoping we can find a way to establish this kind of track 2 dialogue.
I'll try to tackle part of the answer to your question. First of all, very good comment and question. So the issue is to how does one promote more of the young scientists working together? I guess I would say there are 2 basic things. One is, from the government's end, reduce the barriers. And second, provide incentive. And the barriers right now are very, very high. You know, when some Americans wanted to come over here to conferences that we've attended before in the closed cities of Sarov and Snezhinsk, American government wouldn't allow them to go. That's a big barrier. When Russians want to come to the U.S., we make it so difficult for them to get visas. So there are barriers that the government puts in place that just make it very difficult. They need to reduce the barriers. In providing incentive, you know, if we look back at CTR1, there were incentives. The so-called ISTC program, International Science and Technology Center program, provided funding for tens of thousands of Soviet scientists. And they were able to make proposals. Then they would come to Los Alamos to get a partner or some other place and work together. So the incentive was enormous because they were able to actually get support for their scientific work. So one needs to provide funds. We, in the interactions we had directly, what we call lab-to-lab scientific exchange, we also provided those incentives. So if you provide incentive, you make funds available, and then let the scientists compete for those funds, you will get lots of interest. And then you have to let the scientists attend international conferences. You know, that's how they keep up with their areas of science. And we used to do that, but again, it's more difficult now. So this is a place where the government must play a better role.
Yulia Nikitina, MGIMO.
Thank you. Yulia Nikitina, MGIMO University. I have a more general question to the panel. So nuclear arms are actually about sovereignty in general, about assuring your own sovereignty. So from your professional experience, do you believe that there could be other efficient ways of how to assure state sovereignty in order to, not to let other states acquire nuclear weapons? So my question is mostly about sovereignty and alternative ways. Thank you.
Well, you know, we have international air traffic, and controlling airspace over your own country certainly is part of sovereignty. But if we didn't have rules and regulations that were internationally enforced, very few people would be flying commercial aircraft today. And countries really get put on a list if they don't follow certain directions, so that people are warned not to travel there. There are probably 3 or 4 countries right now that are in that category. So recognized long ago that even though every country has sovereignty, that countries couldn't protect the commercial right of their citizens to travel in safe ways if they did not have international rules. If we can do that on international air travel, can't we also make that leap to having some international say on weapons of mass destruction? That's what the Non-Proliferation Treaty is all about. every country that signed into that, if you look at it carefully, gave up some amount of sovereignty in complying with those rules. And so we have other examples of that. So we're going to have to understand, for instance, do Pakistan and India, hypothetically, of course, do they have the right, sovereign right to blow up 100 weapons that would spread global cooling to places all over the world and have 1 billion people starve to death over the next 10 years, even if you cut that by half? I don't think so. So you've got to make a common sense judgment about sovereignty and the ultimate sovereign responsibility of a government. Russia's government, U.S. government, is to protect its security and well-being of its own people. And I think the only way you can do that is through cooperation in the age we're in now.
Go ahead, Mike.
No, if you
Dr.
speak on
Lowenthal,
that,
you wanted to make a comment in the previous round.
He's going to answer
Yeah.
this.
Okay, good.
Mike, of course, you ask a very good question, and it does seem to be that countries associate the sovereignty with nuclear weapons. But if you look at the statistics, there are 192, 194 countries in this world, and only 8 or 9 of them have nuclear weapons. So there are a whole bunch of countries who actually don't think that they need nuclear weapons. And quite frankly, for most countries, nuclear weapons are more trouble than they're worth. And it's only when you get into those difficult circumstances, like in North Korea, for example. I've been to Russia 51 times in doing what I was just told you. I've been to North Korea 7 times. Not successfully, apparently, because they went ahead and developed nuclear weapons. But the political situation in North Korea was such that the conditions didn't exist that we were able together, Russia, the United States, to stop them from getting nuclear weapons. But now the Iran deal is actually quite interesting. My opinion of the Iran deal, they've made a decision that for right now, nuclear weapons are more trouble than they're worth. They're willing to put the idea of finishing developing nuclear weapons on the back burner. So the Iran deal is a good example as to how you actually deal with the issue of a country wanting to get nuclear weapons to protect its sovereignty. But most important thing is there are only 8 or 9 nuclear weapon states in their 194 countries.
So I'd like to just go back to the previous question for a moment, and I was glad to hear the sentiment that the next generation, the new generation, does not have a Cold War mentality. And I would just warn against complacency on that. And I'll quote one of our previous vice presidents who said that this shift is irreversible, but that could change. So as we see nationalism rising in a lot of different countries, we have to guard against that free-flowing energy of nationalism shifting back toward hostilities. And this is a great worry. So you specifically asked, though, what should be done to promote this cooperation? Of course, the National Academy of Sciences and the Russian Academy of Sciences have been promoting cooperation for nearly 60 years under their agreements. But you specifically said get beyond the peer-to-peer. And this is to reinforce what Sig said, that the way that you do that is to work together on mutually beneficial efforts. We both have these needs in a bunch of different areas. So if we work together on those, the institutions will take care of it. I mean, if we enable them to do it, the institutions will come forward and the people will work together.
And the last question from Dr. Petrov, Kirill Petrov.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank our guests and Senator Nunn for the coming, for the visit. And I agree that we have a lack of trust for now. And I think, in my opinion, that we don't have enough understanding of each other political systems and decision-making process. Many politicians are mistaken to see our systems as similar ones. It is a mirror situation, as I think, and it is huge, as Donald Trump would say. So, back to our ships. I would like to ask how the upcoming elections could affect strategic U.S.-Russia relations and dialogue, And especially, how do you think, who would be nominated? Thank you very much.
I think the worst job in the world right now would be a foreign intelligence agent signed to the United States that was charged with the responsibility of predicting the outcome of our election. I have no idea what's going to happen. I know it's not an entirely logical year. You've got very strong anti-establishment feeling. There are probably multiple reasons for that. It's in both parties. It's reflected in not only Donald Trump's vote, but also Bernie Sanders' vote, which is very much anti-establishment. It's also probably reflected by a lot of Ted Cruz's vote. So I'm not sure what's going to happen. We somehow tend to sort it out in the long run, but I frankly think that our election process is too long, it's too expensive, and these days it is entirely too negative. I've said somewhat jokingly, but not completely, when you look at our fiscal challenges, we have huge, huge deficits. We've got demographics that are causing more and more Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security payments. It's a huge challenge, a big fiscal bubble. But if you listen to the candidates on the Republican side, every one of them is for massive tax cuts. Massive tax cuts. If you look at the Democratic candidates, very large spending programs. And so my view is right now, one of the qualifications, it seems to be, to run for President of the United States is not being able to add and subtract. So I'm not predicting what's going to happen. But somehow America's system will sort it out. And somehow whoever's elected president, I think when they get briefed by their military commanders and so forth, will understand the importance of maintaining relationships and building, strengthening relationships with this country we're in right now, Russia. And also with China and also with other things. The world right now is closing in on a lot of people. There are a lot of people out there in America, I think, that are very frustrated. The technology is understood by younger people. Older people are being overwhelmed by it in many cases. The globalization, where something that affects the markets in Asia the next day is in America, stock market, and vice versa. The whole question of trade is frustrating to people. They feel like trade is costing jobs. The fact that technology is causing people to have more and more skills and have to shift skills as jobs are abolished, and that's frustrating people. There's a whole series of things that are frustrating people, and the American political system has to address those. But somehow we will. Somehow we will, because vacuums don't exist very long in democratic countries. Somehow people jump up and fill those vacuums, and I think we're going to need a lot of that. One of the things I think we're all going to have to think about, Russia, United States, and others, is what does robotics do both to jobs and to our educational system. I think the huge displacement of jobs is going to come from robotics and artificial intelligence in the next 10 years, let alone 20 or 30, is going to be a challenge for all of us. I heard somebody say the other day that the factory of the future was going to have only two living beings, one a man and the other one a dog. And yes, and the dog's job would be to keep the man from touching anything, and the man's job would be to feed the dog. So a lot for us to think about.
Folks, any other questions? But be very brief, Sergey. Sergey Shulov from GIMO.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank our honorary guests for coming, and I also would like to say that I admire very much your efforts regarding nuclear arms reductions in the years 19th and 2000. I have a very short question, but I think it's not very easy to answer. What do you think about anti-ballistic missile, and what effect will it have on strategic situation, because in Russia we mostly think that American and NATO desire to develop anti-ballistic missile system will undermine Russian security, and it will diminish our capabilities.
Let me ask if my colleagues want to answer that one. I'll be glad to defer. Michael.
This is a non-answer. The National Academy of Sciences and the Russian Academy of Sciences have a study on this topic right now, and it should come out in late summer, probably. And so I'm postponing the answer until then.
So at Stanford University, we had a study with American missile and nuclear people and Russian expert missile and nuclear people. This was about 5 or 6 years ago. And we asked that question from both sides. And quite frankly, the specialists, both military and technical, that were there, we believed that this problem was a workable problem. Because this idea, when Ronald Reagan actually said, look, we can work the system together. So if one would share early warning systems and do things together, one could lower the concern on the Russian side that these missile defense are actually because of Russia, rather than what we had them designed for. However, the general feeling at that point was that, and I'm going to tell it to you straight, is the Russian government didn't appear to want to solve this problem. They didn't want to have this sort of solution that would actually not make ballistic missile defense a problem by doing things jointly, because it seemed to be a good thing to at least be able to blame the Americans for the fact that they're doing this anti-ballistic missile system. So that was the American view. However, I think the best answer to your question is what was brought up earlier, both by Natalia and Sergei Rogov. This idea of strategic stability has become so much more complex. And what one really needs to do today is to look at that whole spectrum. The Americans don't want to look at the rest because we're very good in all these other things. The prompt global strike, we're building the regional ABM systems. But one now really needs to look at ABM in conjunction with these other things, the advanced conventional ammunition, the space aspects, the cyber aspect, and go back, to where we were 30, 40 years ago and really looking academically first and then from a government standpoint as to how does one keep strategic stability. So I would say, even though my feeling was that Russians didn't want to solve ABM at that point, but I think they have a legitimate concern today that strategic stability, including ABM and these other things, are more complicated than they used to be before. So it's time, for the experts in the two countries to get together and to relook at this. And Micah said you're looking at part of that.
Yeah, and I'll just add, this needs both a policy analysis and a technical analysis. It's too easy for the policy side to get caught in an eddy or a roundabout, just stuck, where the technical analysis is not going to get us all the way there because it's partly a policy question, but it at least grounds the discussions in some reality of what's on the ground and what's possible.
I had two top American officials tell me before I left to come over that they would not only be willing but be anxious to sit back down with Russia and listen carefully to the Russians' concerns on that and to see if we can find ways to alleviate those concerns, because the intention is not to prevent Russia from having a strategic ability to, the intention is not to facilitate a first strike. The whole debate about ABM goes way back, and there was always a fear that a combination of a defensive system was going to be able to cause a incentive to strike first. This is what we call stability, strategic stability. Incentive to strike first, not that you could stop an initial attack, but that if you wiped out the other side 90% or 70%, you could then defend against what was left. And that is that's an unstable situation. That's where the ABM treaty came from. And I think we have to go back to some of those fundamental thoughts in discussing this issue, because our system now, according to everybody that I've talked to in the military or civilian that has anything to do with ballistic missile defense, is a limited system to protect against third country attacks and is not intended to basically disrupt the Russian strategic deterrence. But that's a matter of interpretation, and that's why technical people have to sit down and think about it. Policy people aren't going to solve this problem without a lot of help from good faith efforts on the part of scientific and military professionals sitting down and talking to each other. I know that another Russian fear is that these defensive systems could be turned into short-term, short-range offensive systems. Our people say that's not accurate, but that's something that ought to be talked about. I'm like Sig. I think this problem can be worked out if we have good faith effort, but it's sometimes politically convenient to never solve a problem. And this one can be solved, I think. We wrote a report about 2 years ago called Building Mutual Security. It'd be available on I can get it, we can get a website. We had a section in there on ballistic missile defense. One of our panel members was a 4-star former commander of the Strategic Command, General Cartwright. We had a total of 13 retired admirals and generals on that panel, and they all signed off on, including about 4 Russian military, including former rocket forces people. They all signed off on a framework to address this ballistic missile defense problem. But neither of our governments took up that kind of framework. So the problem, I think, is solvable, but it's going to take a good faith effort. And as I mentioned earlier, it is not in the U.S. interest, in my view, to have the Russian president ever believe they've got to fire missiles very quickly or lose them. That's not in our interest. And it's not in our interest for your warning systems not for you not to be confident in your warning systems. Neither is it in Russia's interest to put America under that kind of short-term framework. That's why I always talk about warning and decision time. And ballistic missile defense is a part of this equation. There are other parts, but it is an important part we have to discuss.
Thank you. Senator Nguyen mentioned General Cartwright, and actually he spoke in this room to these young people a couple of weeks ago with Ambassador Pickering. And it's a pleasure for me that we continue this conversation, this dialogue. We made another step, and I would like to express my sincere gratitude to our U.S. guests. And I think all of us made a critical, directly or indirectly, critical statement that we need a communication. We need to talk. What is important that we can understand each other. We have disagreements, sometimes severe disagreements, but what we can enjoy is understanding each other, and we need to continue this dialogue. And from our side, from the REACT side, and from the side of our partners, we are ready to contribute to this further dialogue at all levels, young generation, distinguished generation, and to mix these two together. Thank you very much. Thank you.